Hi, welcome to another segment of Around Town. I'm your host, Andy Amrine, and welcome to Bethel Park TV Cable. We're going to be leaving the studio here, and we're going to actually be leaving Bethel Park. We're going to step out of our area here, and we're heading down to the Heinz History Center. We're going to go take a look at We Can Do It, a World War II exhibit, and we're going to have a nice conversation with the curator, Leslie. She's going to talk about the exhibit, how it impacts Pittsburgh, the residents, and also how it impacts a lot of the residents of Bethel Park. So sit back and enjoy another segment. Thank you.
I'm Leslie Sibilic. I'm the Curator of History here at the Heinz History Center.
Okay, well, can you give us a little bit of background with yourself, how you became the curator here? What was your previous job? What have you done to get to this point in your life?
Well, there's two pieces to that, because on the one hand, there are my previous jobs. I worked for a number of years as a Curator of Humanities with an organization in Kansas City, Missouri that worked with the National Endowment for the Humanities on traveling exhibits, and had also worked with a couple of institutions way out in western Arkansas on local history, industrial history, things like that. In fact, there, one of the things I worked on was a relocation of a collection related to Camp Chaffee, which was a major World War II armored division training center. But you might wonder, well, how did you get from Arkansas and Missouri back to Pittsburgh? But I'm originally from northwestern Pennsylvania. Okay. I grew up in Crawford County, and my parents and most of the extended family of aunts and uncles and grandparents were all from Pittsburgh. Beechview, Mount Washington, Carrick, different parts of town. So eventually I was looking at some position that would bring me back to the area, family considerations here, and so that's how I ended up here. It was a combination of professional interest and then personal interest.
So the Heinz History Center, how long have you been here?
I've been here about 2.5 years. It's going on 3 years. This is the third exhibition that I've done with the History Center.
What were the first two?
If you happen to see Pennsylvania's Civil War, I worked on that.
Absolutely.
And then last summer we had the wonderful project on the Steamboat Arabia, story of Pittsburgh's connection to our rivers and the Western River steamboat industry. So I also worked on that.
Okay, now the World War II exhibit that we're going to see today, what can you tell us about it? How did you formulate? What was your plan to pull this together? Was this years in the making, or did you just wake up one morning and say, I'm going to do this tomorrow?
I would say a little of both.
Okay.
It wasn't that I woke up the next day, but you know, they've been talking about this subject for years and in a couple different angles. There's been a great interest here in the story of the Jeep and its birthplace in Butler, so that had been one ongoing conversation. And also some interest in World War II, just the experience of residents in the city, the huge contribution of industry. Now, for me personally, when we really started working on the bones of the exhibit, it was really after the Arabia exhibit opened, and then you turn right around, and from riverboats, we started working on World War II. So the real collecting and kind of ferreting out the stories and who can be involved, what kinds of artifacts do we have. That started last year at just about this time, in June and July.
So it takes years to plan it, but it takes you almost a year to collect all the artifacts and put everything together?
At a minimum,
for it?
yes.
Okay.
You know, this is we were talking about beforehand with a TV show, you end up with hours of film and a little piece makes it in. You know, you cast a wide net for material. You're looking for uniforms and personal objects and home front pieces. So you end up with a massive amount of stuff, and it really does take that to then be able to say, okay, here are the really wonderful stories, here's this great story about a person, or here's a really cool object, and you kind of put those all together in the end.
Well, what can you tell us now about the exhibit? This is, you have different aspects, different parts of the exhibit. There's, you know, personal connections, there's Pittsburgh connections, there's the war room itself, I'll say. Walk us through the exhibit itself as somebody first enters the exhibit. What are they feeling? What are they seeing? What do they sense?
Well, when they first enter this exhibit, they're going to walk into someone's living room, or at least a setup like a living room. I think in this, I must say that it's not just me. I mean, an exhibit is created by many people working together, but one of the things that we felt from the start is we wanted to give people a sense of what was the reality of families here in Pittsburgh or in Bethel Park, in Carrick, or in Beechview. This realization in the 1930s, you have a terrible economic situation here, and the world overseas just seems to be getting worse and worse and worse. What are they facing? What are they feeling? You know, a lot of them, if they're parents in their early 40s, mid 40s, by the 1930s, late 1930s, many of those fathers could very well have been soldiers in World War I. How did they feel about now looking and thinking, oh my gosh, our sons could be facing the same thing we did? So you walk in and you really enter in a living room. There's a radio playing. We've kind of set the stage on September 1st, 1939, which is the day that Hitler invaded Poland. Technically, that's the start of World War II. And then you kind of move, you do a little bit of time travel there, because when you enter the main gallery, the rest of the actual exhibit, after you have this, maybe a little bit of a mindset of worry or contemplation, we want people to put themselves in the shoes of the parents, or the shoes of a young man or young woman saying, I could go off to war, my brother could go off to war. And then we trace a little bit of that background. So you have an entry gallery that really looks a little bit more at the economic and political situation in the 1930s. There's the Depression here. There's a huge photo mural of a shanty town, a Hooverville, and that's at 17th Street and Penn. So that's here in the Strip District, not that far from our building, to say, look what people here were facing. I mean, this was a part of their everyday reality. And some other great artifacts over there that relate to the Depression and the Civilian Conservation Corps. Then you kind of walk through an area that really looks at the rise of Germany, the Third Reich, Mussolini and Italy, Japan. How do we end up in a war where you have Germany and Italy over here and Japan all the way on the other side of the globe? How on earth does that all fit together? We felt we couldn't assume that people would know all that, so there's a little bit of an intro. We give you all the main players, here's who's involved, here's the picture. We know everybody kind of knows what Hitler looks like, but we weren't sure, for example, that they might know what the Japanese leaders look like, or China figures into the story too. And so we have a few other people like that.
All right, Leslie, you were talking about coming to power and a few other things. This America First Committee, what are we looking at here?
Well, this is a great piece that reminds us that before Pearl Harbor, Americans were not all on the same page about whether or not we should go to war. There were a lot of people in this country who were very concerned about America getting pulled back into another global war so soon after World War I. Out of those many different concerns, there were a lot of groups that organized, peace groups that organized to protest American entry into the war in multiple ways. One of those groups, and it was a later entrant, was something called America First. This was an organization that first grew up around Chicago in 1940. And here, the letter that we have in our case here shows the announcement of the formation of a chapter here in Pittsburgh in April of '41. One of the most fascinating things about America First, here's a group whose members included people like Charles Lindbergh, Gerald Ford, John F. Kennedy. And America First argued, as the name sounds, that we needed to put America first. A strong defense was the position they were taking. They were meeting here at Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall for a rally on December 7th, 1941, when news of the attack on Pearl Harbor hit. And person after person tried to let this group know what had happened, and they didn't want to believe the news at first. And it took most of the day before they finally were convinced that they needed to tell the membership. So the membership is here for this rally, and they're meeting about this, and most of the people in the audience and Soldiers and Sailors did not even know for much of the morning that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. You know, we have an oral history here in another part of the exhibit that has, it's an audio that has Dan Rooney and David McCullough talking about their memories as kids. And one of them is talking about his memory of Pearl Harbor, which is being in the Syria Mosque on December 7th, 1941, and coming out into the street, and he sees these crowds of people all in a furor because the news about Pearl Harbor has broken. At the same time that literally right across the lawn here in Soldiers and Sailors, there's a group meeting for the America First rally who has no idea for the larger part of the day what has happened. Of course, once they do realize what has happened, America First dissolves the next day. It's gone a day after this happens. But it was just one of countless organizations, and there were leftist groups and rightist groups, but for us it was a really important piece to remind people that in the lead up to Pearl Harbor, many Americans had very different views about World War II, and it really was Pearl Harbor that provides that catalyst that most people after that, there's no question anymore. Just like America First, game over now, we're going to move ahead and we're all in this together. World War II officially starts, of course, with Pearl Harbor for America, but I think one of the things we really wanted local audiences to realize is that here in Pittsburgh, because of the city's industrial prominence, you can honestly say that the factories here really start fighting World War II by 1940. We're really in the war as a city and the industries at least a year before Pearl Harbor happens. As FDR begins to request more federal funding, U.S. Steel, Westinghouse, Bantam, Curtiss-Wright, they're all of the major production they're doing for the war is starting way before Pearl Harbor. In fact, we have the earliest known example of the Jeep prototype, one of the Bantam reconnaissance cars in our industry section, and it's a piece from 1940. And I think that's one thing we really wanted people to realize, that this wasn't something that all of a sudden Pearl Harbor happens and we're at war, that there were a lot of things building up to that.
All right, Leslie, what are we standing in front of on this one?
Well, I'd say what we're standing in front of now is probably one of the most well-known pieces in the exhibit. This is another piece on loan from the Smithsonian. This is from the Smithsonian's Museum of National History. It's the History Museum rather than the Air and Space Museum. And this is one of the earliest known prototypes of what we now call the Jeep. This is a Bantam reconnaissance car, born in Butler. Of course, the creator of the Jeep was really the small American Bantam Car Company. And this is an example of one of the earliest ones that they did after this little company successfully competed for a federal contract to basically create the Jeep, to innovate a small, go anywhere, do anything combat vehicle. Of course, that's a much larger story than a few brief minutes of an interview, but Bantam really created the design for what became this car that is now an American icon. What we have here is the earliest known example. It's not the original prototype, but behind it on the wall is a photo of the creators at Bantam in September 1940 when the very first prototype of the Jeep rolled out of their factory. And so for us, this is a really special piece. It speaks volumes about kind of the innovative spirit of Western Pennsylvania, and I know that folks up in Butler are really happy to see it on display somewhere as well. In this case, the vehicle was already here. It's been on display at the History Center, but it moved into the gallery, and it's got the place of honor here in our Hall of Industry. It's one of the great contributions of Western PA. We're fortunate to have it here. And so we wanted people to understand, for Pittsburghers, when you talk about World War II, they begin what really is a war effort on the home front before we're officially in the war. So we go through the industry, and one of the things we really wanted to do was just show the wide variety of things that were made here or that were developed here. Some of them, the final version of a project wasn't necessarily made here, but they're doing a lot of experimentation, a lot of research. They're doing the science behind developments. For example, PPG, ultimately some of their big laminated airplane windshields are being made in plants in, for example, Crystal City, Missouri, but they're also working in this region on the science behind those. PPG develops laminated windshields that, I don't want to say they're totally bulletproof, but they're helping to make sure that flak and shots from other planes are resisted by a windshield. You're a pilot, you're way up in the air, you don't want a hole in your windshield. So it's things like that. Westinghouse is the same way. Experiments with radio communication, different kinds of armaments. We have some really interesting small Westinghouse pieces, and then big pieces too. One of the nice finds for this exhibit that we didn't know about was before. The Smithsonian has a big airplane propeller that was made by a factory here in the Beaver area from Curtiss Wright Company. And it turns out that the largest airplane propeller factory during the war was built in Beaver in about 1940-41, and the Smithsonian still had one of the propellers made at that plant.
Leslie, this propeller came from the Smithsonian, you told us, but this has some unique ties to Pittsburgh?
It does. Now, to be very specific on the Smithsonian, this piece is actually from the National Air and Space Museum. We have loans in the exhibit from both the National Museum of American History and Air and Space. And so I know that they like to have their own plugs put into things. But yeah, the propeller was made at the Curtiss Wright Propeller Factory that was built at the very beginning of the war and really before American entry into the war in Beaver Township. Now that's Vanport Township area, so outside of the city. At the time the plant was built, it was the largest propeller factory in the world. Reputed to be a Nazi target. I've seen the reputed part a lot. I've not seen a lot of direct evidence for that, but supposedly it was one of the Nazi targets on a hit list. And in this case, the propeller is for a Helldiver. It was a carrier-based dive bomber plane. In fact, the last dive bomber produced for the military. But one of the really cool things about the Curtiss Wright plant that made this propeller is they didn't do just propellers for their own planes. They manufactured propellers for a wide variety of planes during the war. Everything from a Helldiver to the Martin Marauder, which was probably the largest plane flying at that time. It employed about 4,000 area people. People were recruited from all over the city to move to the Beaver Township area. The crush of people was so much, they had to build a lot of new housing, they had to pass new ordinances about streets and things like that. But the plant was reputed to be the most modern at the time. They welcomed women employees. In fact, they encouraged it. And they built reputedly about 100 or 150,000 propellers during the course of the war. Today, the plant operates as, I think it's the Cutler Hammer Eaton plant out there. So the building is actually still being used for manufacturing purposes. But a great object. I don't know if it had ever been on display at the Smithsonian. We love to find pieces that have a great local connection but have been kind of forgotten. And, this was part of a search for Smithsonian objects. And I suspect that the curator who's been working on this hadn't had it out in display for a long time. I know the Helldiver. I think the plane is out on display there, but I'm not sure that this propeller was out. So for us, it's a great find and a piece that we're lucky they were willing to loan it to us.
You know, with this Pittsburgh-based type of exhibit, do you have information as far as like the number of people that were involved at the factories, the number of workers, the hours, the shifts, how much of different items that they produced? Was there ammunition? Did they make tanks? Is there a wide spectrum of everything out of Pittsburgh,
spectrum of numbers. And you're asking me something. I must admit I don't have all the numbers at the top of my head, but millions of some things. And I'll tell you the big number for this region in terms of what's most well known is that by the end of the war, Pittsburgh Industries are producing 95 million tons of steel, which was more than practically all of the Axis forces combined. A huge number, millions of bombs. They produced tank armor here. They didn't necessarily produce a whole tank here, but the key of Pittsburgh was that because of the science and the tech knowledge that was here, which it's just a different version of the same, the kind of tech strengths that are today, what they were doing was producing components. So there was a U.S. Steel plant near Sharon that did tank armor. Westinghouse devised this little contraption that was called a tank gun stabilizer, which you have a tank, it's got its treads and it's going along the ground, and the tank doesn't really go smooth. It's not on a highway. You don't know what kind of terrain you're on. The gun moves up and down. What Westinghouse created is this little device that allows the gun to stay stable. Think of it in a very simple way, like a shock absorber for a very large gun, which increased accuracy of the weapon. So some of what Pittsburgh was doing were things like that. The propeller plant in Beaver, the count I've seen in one, and they tend to not be, the numbers vary, but as many as 100 or 150,000 airplane propellers during the war. And so huge numbers. And for plants, it varied by plant. Dervaux had as many as 25,000 people. U.S. Steel, at one point, they're hiring 32,000 women to support jobs that were vacated by men, and that's in the midst of larger employee figures of 100,000 people for something. So huge numbers.
So basically with Pittsburgh and Southwest Pennsylvania almost, that every family pretty much was involved in the war effort to some degree because of the factories and what was being produced here for the war effort. Every family had to be touched.
Every family. And it was true both in terms of the effort. Plants were running 24 hours a day, so there's 3 shifts going. Your father might be on one shift, your mother might be on another shift. The children are going to be impacted, both in terms of what they're doing at school. They're gathering scrap metal, they're learning more about the geography of the region. There are many people in the area said when they heard that Pearl Harbor was bombed, their first question was, where is Pearl Harbor? Learn the map, learn the context. And then, the military, ultimately, again, the figures vary, but maybe 9 or 10% of the population was actually in the military. And so it's really true. Almost everybody knew someone, an uncle, a brother, a father, a neighbor, a very different context from today. And in a way, the first part of the exhibit kind of follows that experience of what it must have been like for people here in the region. They're in a period of great turmoil here. They begin to watch more and more going on overseas. It keeps getting worse and it keeps getting worse. And finally, the funding for a lot of the industrial production happens after Germany invades France. This is May and June 1940. That's when FDR really begins to ask for a huge increase in federal funding. And that's when a lot of Pittsburgh industries really kick in.
BPTV is a benefit to any organization in Bethel Park. Not only do they have the community bulletin board, but you can also produce your own shows, which is a really fun and interesting way to get your information into the community. The library is currently producing 4 shows. They're all available on YouTube, also on the library's website, and you can see them in rotation on BPTV. It's a way to get the staff's face known in the community so that when we're out at the Giant Eagle, you recognize us and say, hey, I saw you on BPTV, and that's a lot of fun for us. I've worked in 2 other communities as a librarian, and while both had TV studios in their school districts, I didn't know about the service, and I was never approached to say, hey, you want to do a show or a promo or anything. In that way, I find BPTV to be really fantastic for any organization in the Bethel Park community. I find that BPTV is very proactive. I've been approached about show ideas, and I've also feel welcome to go down to the office and pitch an idea. BPTV staff and volunteers are very helpful and very knowledgeable. Another good opportunity is to send a couple members of your organization over to BPTV to be trained on the equipment in case there aren't volunteers available. There is an emphasis in education in general, and libraries in particular, to create maker spaces, which are areas where people can come and use equipment to create music or music videos or videos of any kind, or also stop motion animation. With BPTV right here, the library has not had to invest in that kind of space, where many other libraries are doing so across the country. Right here in Pittsburgh, the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh has spent a tremendous amount of money to create maker spaces in their facilities, and we're fortunate that we don't have to do that. BPTV is indeed the pulse of Bethel Park. It is a wonderful state-of-the-art community asset. Residents of Bethel Park are very lucky to live in a community that supports not only a state-of-the-art television studio, but also a fantastic community center and a library. It's a great opportunity to learn and also to promote your organization. I'm Christine McIntosh, Executive Director of Bethel Park Public Library and producer of Check It Out on BPTV.
So you kind of go through the work day, and some people are at U.S. Steel, and some are at Bantam, and some are working at other plants in the area, and then the exhibit switches to the room we're in now, which is true home front. You get a chance to see a lot of the uniforms of local people. Someone dresses up like Uncle Sam for a water bond drive. So even if someone's not working in a factory on the home front, they're doing a lot of other jobs in transportation, in war bond, in patriotism, and there's a lot of material like that.
With you having family in this area, did you come across any family ties or anything to the
I do know of some family ties to the war. I don't have anything in the exhibit on that. I have a grandfather who worked in the kind of custom mold making industry. He did complex plaster molds for industrial products. You have a product that you want to eventually mass produce, and you need to have something made to kind of move it forward in that process. So you have your template, you have your prototype. How do you get that to be the product you produce in the factory? And a grandfather who did a lot of that kind of work, and among them he worked with, as he said on a couple oral history tapes, I didn't work for them, I worked with them. Mine Safety Appliances, he did some contract work doing molds and things related to breathing apparatus and things like that. So always had the stories. Had uncles who served in the war, for example. So, and like many other people, like some of the residents of Bethel Park who I've spoken with, had a grandfather who was an air raid warden.
So let's see, what are we looking at here, air raid warden? Now you said this has some Bethel Park connection to this?
It does have a Bethel Park piece. Okay. It's all material related to air raid wardens. I think one of the really familiar home front experiences was that experience of blackouts and air raids. It's one that a lot of people who were kids then remember. a very exciting, frightening type of thing. But there is a piece here. You know, the air raid system was based on local neighborhoods.
Okay.
You see the air raid warden sign here. Zones, think of that like the equivalent of a ward, a larger area. Sector would maybe be a neighborhood, and the post was street by street. So you had a lot of local residents from these neighborhoods who were working as air raid wardens. Someone would go door to door, making sure you turned out all the lights, or making sure you knew that the warning had even been issued. And the piece here on the right, Malcolm F. Lovejoy, was a Bethel Park resident. He worked as an air raid warden in Bethel Park, and his son, Dave, has lent that piece to us for the exhibit.
Okay, with the air raid wardens and so forth, do you know how threatened Pittsburgh was, or how they felt with all this industry here and all the LSTs being made and the munitions and so forth? How serious of a threat was there? Anything uncovered on that aspect, or espionage here in Pittsburgh?
That's a really good question. In fact, when we found this piece, I had spoken to the Bethel Park Lions Club about that very issue. As with the industry in Pittsburgh, it started before we were actually in the war. There was a lot of early fear. I think that historians now will tell you that the fear was greater than the reality.
Okay.
But in 40, 41, 42 is when, and in fact the air raid wardens, the air raids started before Pearl Harbor in April of 1941, which gives you a sense of the worry here because, as you mentioned, the industry. In 1942, there were a couple of pretty well-known episodes. U-boats had let off some crews that landed at New York and in Florida. They were sabotage crews. They weren't the most efficient sabotage crews, and one of the guys in New York was caught, and so the episode, they revealed themselves, and they didn't actually succeed in their plot, but they had landed in this country to blow up industrial plants. And so there were some real reasons. I mean, there's clear evidence now that there were U-boats that got all the way up towards New York. They were along the coast of the United States. There never were really much in the way of plane flyovers, but there was also fear that here in America, resident aliens, you had Italian and German residents who were not yet citizens. They were here still as people who were still technically citizens of those nations. There was a lot of concern internally as well. You asked me as part of our discussion about how real were the fears of threats to Pittsburgh. This is material that was owned by John Leahy, who worked here in Pittsburgh. His wartime service was as an FBI agent here stationed in Pittsburgh, and he investigated cases of industrial sabotage. And the material in the case was what he used to tap phone lines. The FBI had agents who were trained in how to climb up telephone poles or identify main boxes and tap phone lines. There's a piece in here that looks like a lineman's phone set. It looks like some of you may remember what this is, some may not if you're looking at your smartphone, but they used this piece that looks like an old telephone handset to tap directly into phone lines. And part of the interesting thing of it is that by this time period, technically, evidence from phone taps was illegal. After a couple of notorious cases during Prohibition, the federal government passed the Federal Communications Act in 1934, which said you can't use phone tap evidence. Supreme Court upheld this in 1939, but in 1940, President FDR got a secret memo passed that allowed for using phone tap in cases of suspected sabotage for people who were suspected of being spies. So think of it again, our terms of homeland security, the sense of within the boundaries of the U.S. to protect us, they were doing something that technically was illegal, but it had the president's blessing. So in this case, John Leahy tapped phone lines. Then he spent the rest of his life here in the Pittsburgh area, but it's a really good reminder that here in the city, there was a lot of fear about enemy agents trying to infiltrate, bomb our factories, set up sabotage at everything from the Jeep plant to Curtiss-Wright, and the fears were real. So, were we really going to get a Pearl Harbor style attack on Pittsburgh? Probably not. But I think that the paranoia about the reality that people wanted to maybe attack some of these plants, there was a kernel of truth in those fears. And in that sense, you know, the idea of air raids was, if you train people to respond this way, they won't be as scared if something really happens.
The preparation
so
was
merit.
everything.
There was merit in the preparation.
Wow. I love the Bethel Park touch.
Well, and that's a great, you know, it's a great piece. You get out to different neighborhoods and you begin to talk to people and they say, well, I don't know if this is something that you'll use, but, you know, my dad or my mother, and we love to be able to include that material. Yeah. So we were thrilled, and, you know, we love to be able to put faces on things too. You know, this is a real guy from a real neighborhood. His neighbors knew him. He was the person who had to make sure that they were following the rules. And he's one great little local example of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people throughout the region who did that. And then, as you mentioned, we moved from that. We have a section that really looks at George C. Marshall. He's the Uniontown boy who becomes the chief of staff for the U.S. Army. He gets that job on the day Hitler invades Poland, has a huge job to kind of transform this very small, largely unprepared army into a real fighting force. And we look a little bit at that, and then you move into a section that really is the war room or combat. And we really concentrated on finding objects that connected to personal stories. So if there's a uniform jacket or a trench knife, there's a name and a face and a story that goes with that. We focus on these really great personal connections that symbolized the contributions of area residents. That includes a uniform and cap from probably our most famous local World War II soldier, which would be Jimmy Stewart from Indiana. So we have one of his uniforms as well as his signature on some papers that he signed when he was still here stateside. You know, he's a great story. The U.S. Army Air Corps really never wanted to send him overseas, and he really had to fight to get into the war. He did not want to be stateside. And that's another one where we look a little bit at that story and really point out this famous local resident who truly was a hero, but he wasn't the only one. And so we kind of emphasize those stories as part of combat.
Leslie, another great story. What can you tell us about this? It's something as simple as a footlocker.
In this case, the footlocker represents a couple of really important stories about the war, and in this case, about women during the war. You know, we've talked about women on the home front, but I think we also need to remember that there were a lot of women who served with the military. Many of them were WACs, WAVs, they were serving with the auxiliary. But U.S. Army nurses were a part of the Army. They weren't with the WACs, they weren't with another kind of auxiliary. They served with the Army, and many of them served overseas. This footlocker belonged to Mary Sullivan. She was originally a native of Bradford, PA. She went to nursing school here in the Lawrenceville area. And when Pearl Harbor happened and war broke out, she was one of 3 women in her class who agreed to kind of work on their degree and graduate early with the clear understanding that they were going to enter the service. They were going to join the Army as nurses. And she served overseas. She served in England, tending to soldiers after the D-Day invasion. She served throughout that time period. She was actually I believe in London on VE Day. And after victory in Europe, the nurses were prepared to go to another battle theater. Mary Sullivan recalled later that her footlocker was packed and ready to be shipped to the Philippines. They were heading to the Pacific to be a part of the medical assistance for the Pacific War, and really dreaded it. I mean, for all the horrors of war in the European theater, the Pacific theater had a much worse reputation for the experience of the soldiers, combat wounds. It was vicious. For Mary, and here's the other big story, you know, she ultimately didn't go. Before she was shipped out, the bombs were dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which ended the war. And for Mary, that was the final part of her service. She avoided having to go to the Pacific Theater. But a wonderful story that reminds us that women, as well as men, were serving overseas during the war. And in Mary's case, she was a part of the Army, a nurse with the U.S. Army.
All right, Leslie, what do we have here?
What I actually want to talk about in here are the bayonet and the knife you see in the middle of the case, along with the little patch that has a 4 on it. These are materials from Jack Watson, a neighbor of Bethel Park, is saying Upper St. Clair resident, who was a veteran who participated in the Battle of Iwo Jima. Watson was with the U.S. Marine Corps, and he was actually part of what was called a replacement division. So they were troops held back at first with the plan that they would go in after the main invasion, a secondary force. At first, his superiors didn't believe that his unit would go into battle at Iwo Jima, but as time went on, it became clear that the battle was so fierce and there were such horrendous casualties that this division, the 24th replacement, they were part of the Marines' 4th Division, were going to go in. And in fact, Jack did go in. He was a part of the Battle of Iwo Jima. After the main part of the battle, he recalled later that his own bayonet was so gory, we'll say, he felt like he would never get it clean. And so he stuck it in the sand. He left it on Iwo Jima, but he felt, the Marines are not going to be happy if I come back without a bayonet. So he picked up another one, a cleaner bayonet that didn't have such a reminder for him of the human cost of the war, and made it back with that. And in this instance, in this case, we have multiple of these items from someone from Upper St. Clair who really participated in that keystone battle in a really crucial way. It stayed with him his whole life. I know that his family was really moved that he actually agreed to lend the pieces for the exhibit. So again, we're really fortunate to have them here. Just one reminder of the many local men who really performed to the utmost level of devotion as part of the U.S. cause during the war.
Over 1 million people in the U.S. get cancer each year. Today we will be informing you about melanoma or skin cancer.
Symptoms of melanoma are changes in existing moles, the development of new pigmented or unusual looking growths on your skin, chills, cough, and feeling weak or achy.
Some risk factors of melanoma are fair skin and light-colored hair, applying sunscreen, avoiding midday sun, wearing protective clothing, wearing a hat, sunglasses, and avoiding tanning beds are all ways of preventing melanoma.
Skin cancer is the most common form of cancer. In fact, 1 in 5 Americans will develop skin cancer in their lifetime. If you experience any of these symptoms, contact your doctor immediately. Yearly professional skin exams are recommended. For more information on these cancers, visit cancer.org.
We knew going into this that one thing we couldn't do was tell the entire story of World War II. This is about a 10,000 square foot exhibit. If you imagine the National World War II Museum in New Orleans is like 6 times this size or more, they don't even come close to telling the whole story. So we knew that that was not something we were going to be able to do. So instead we focused on these really great personal connections that symbolized the contributions of area residents. And you finish up combat. There's some great Iwo Jima artifacts. We have a small listening room. It's really a contemplative space where we have oral histories that play clips. They're small clips, but from real veterans talking about their experience in combat. You can listen to those. One of them tells the story of a guy who landed on Iwo Jima. There's someone who landed on D-Day. And then there's kind of a wrap-up area there, and you have a chance at the end to record your comments, what you think about the exhibit. So in a way, it's a path that follows what might have been the experiences of Pittsburghers or people from Bethel Park. The war is coming. They realize this is dawning. they end up involved in the effort on this end first through factories and through home front developments. The boys head off to war. You know, America, it takes a while for us to actually get in the war because you have to recruit everybody and then train them. And combat really is the culmination of the journey. And then you kind of hear from some of the survivors as you head out. I think for a lot of us who worked on this project, not just me, it was personal. We have a staff member whose grandfather was a fighter pilot, and someone whose father fought in the war. You know, I had multiple relatives. And so yes, it's a history exhibit and it's a history story, but I think it was personal to a lot of us in that sense. I think that made it a little bit different in terms of the commitment to it.
Can you tell us on the Heinz History Center side of it, this exhibit is going to be open till when?
It will be open through early January 2016, so people have plenty of time to come and see it. No excuses for missing it, but
7 days a week?
7 days a week, and throughout this time period, watch. We have a lot of great programs scheduled. Everything from Smithsonian curators, we have flag folding events, so we'll have a lot of interesting programming associated with it that I'm sure people will be interested in seeing it multiple times and kind of catching some of these events.
Now, you're going to come out to Bethel Park in June 28th?
I am going to be in Bethel Park on June 28th, that's Sunday, at the Schoolhouse Arts Center, talking a little bit more about World War II, the exhibit, and going through some of the really interesting finds we looked at, and really talking about the story largely as it relates to the home front.
Yeah. Well, we're looking forward to having you out there and talking to our residents. Well, Leslie, I want to thank you for the time you've taken with us today. This has been, you know, I can feel the love and the passion of what you do, but I can just feel the sense of what it is meant to not just the residents of Bethel Park, but the city of Pittsburgh and the people that come through the exhibits and so forth. This is a very touching, very moving exhibit, and you know, from this Jeep to the uniforms to the whole bit, it's been a lot of fun. I want to thank you for your time.
You're welcome. You know, as I said, I hope that people do get a little bit of that sense out of it, but it's such a remarkable story. You know, the city came together in a very unique way, and Pittsburgh made an incredibly important contribution. Pittsburgh and the neighborhoods and the region, and so that's really something that deserves both marking and then celebrating as well.
So I don't know if I can put you on the spot. One last time, you're saying this goes to January. Any sneak peek of what the next exhibit you're working on?
The next thing I believe in this space will be a project looking at vintage toys, 50s, 60s. It'll be great. I mean, totally different kind of concepts and content from World War II, but I feel
another story. I feel another story. We'll have to be back. So appreciate you watching Bethel Park TV Cable, and don't forget, Leslie is going to be on June 28th at the Schoolhouse Arts Center, so you can get a meter and in-depth stories as far as the involvement of Bethel Park with World War II. Thank you for watching.